So to come to men, how's the sexual revolution worked out for men?
So I think the only beneficiaries of our current casual sexual culture are a minority of men. So I write about the Hugh Hefners of the world. You know, I start the book by talking about Hugh Hefner and Marilyn Monroe as the two icons of the sexual revolution who had completely different experiences of it. Marilyn Monroe was basically destroyed by the sexual revolution, whereas Hugh Hefner had a ball. You know, he did eventually end up being fairly lonely and pathetic, and he ended his life no longer being the glamorous playboy, but he had a lot of fun along the way. Yeah, I think he's one of these rare people who has been able to enjoy the fruits of the sexual revolution without really suffering any costs. For most men, that's not true. And for most men, you know, they don't have access to a harem of 20-something blondes, as Hefner did. And actually, this peculiar thing that on the one hand, we've never had a more hypersexual public life and had sort of fewer inhibitions about sex, but people are also actually having less sex. There's the sex recession, so-called, the sex depression, where young people in particular are having much less sex, actually, than their supposedly inhibited, prudish grandparents, which is a funny sort of contradiction. But I think it's probably because people aren't forming relationships, so they're having more casual sexual relationships. And
are they having more, or is it true that for many young people they're delaying or not having sexual relationships in quite high numbers now?
It depends on which group you're talking about. So very attractive men are able to have lots of casual relationships with lots of women, and most women will have no difficulty getting casual sex at all. You know, whether or not they really want it, they'll have no difficulty accessing it. But what women often struggle to get is a committed relationship. And actually people
Where are all the good men?
They're enjoying being Hugh Hefners. Well, it depends on who you're talking about.
Isn't
it? But it's this short-termism thing, you know, that if you're a young, attractive man who can attract lots of matches on Tinder, it may be more tempting to enjoy the Hugh Hefner lifestyle rather than to commit to one woman, even though that would be more meaningful and more satisfying long term. But if you can enjoy the kind of the harem experience.
What if you're a thoroughly decent, very capable, you know, protector, provider type male that would be on paper very attractive, but not through social media? What happens to you then?
It's often really hard. I mean, I don't want to be all doom and gloom, because people clearly are. They are still forming relationships. They are still getting married, having children. You know, it's not a complete disaster by any means. But it does seem as if it's more difficult because that's not the template now. That's not the default setting. And I think people are being channeled into more dysfunctional relationship norms. I mean, one of the things that's worth remembering is that our species norm is polygyny, where you have 80% of cultures on the anthropological record have been polygynous, where you have high status men have multiple wives and low status men have no wives. And Christianity is unusual in insisting on monogamy. We inherited it from Rome, but it was a very important component of 2,000 years of Christian civilization, which now, of course, we've mostly rejected. And even though legally you're still only allowed to marry one person, having sex outside of marriage is now completely socially permissible, and so people are in practice seem to be kind of being drawn back towards our species norm, having lifted the monogamous restriction, you know. But I argue in the book, and I think really strongly that that monogamous restriction produces much better outcomes, particularly for women. and for low status men. But there are all sorts of ways in which monogamous cultures do better than polygynous cultures. Lower crime rates, lower domestic violence rates, less economic inequality, all sorts of good outcomes that come with insisting on monogamy. And this is a beautiful example of what happens when you just press the freedom lever and allow people to rid themselves of all restrictions. People will often, when you do that, tend to unconsciously rush towards actually less just ways of doing things, that we will revert to our species norm, supposedly as an expression of our freedom, but in fact producing much worse outcomes, particularly for the most vulnerable people, particularly for women and children. The phrase I use a lot, borrowed from the historian Irish Tawney, is freedom for the pike is death for the minnow. When you have a social environment which is not equal, where people are different from each other in all sorts of important ways, physical, psychological, related to age, related to vulnerabilities of youth or disability or whatever, just allowing everyone to be free, very often results in the outcome where actually it is the most powerful members of society who, through their freedom, are able to exploit the least powerful.